We are back on Taking Care of Business on Current Radio News Talk 1180. Our next guest wrote a book about a story that I couldn't put this thing back, put it down. It's the story of Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald, the man who built Sears, and their quest to help education in the segregated South. Stephanie, welcome to Taking Care of Business.
Thank you. I'm glad to be with you.
What a great story. Why is this?
It is a great story.
Why is it such an untold story? I mean, I'm a pretty good history buff. I was going to be a history teacher at one time, and I didn't know anything about this.
Well, that's a really good question. I think one thing it points to is how easily the fairly recent past can just slip into oblivion. Mm-hmm. Both these men, during their lifetimes, were extremely well known. 100 years ago when they met, Booker T. Washington was the most well-known African-American in the country. He was very widely regarded, highly regarded, very well-known, the author, of course, of Up From Slavery, the founder of Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. He had had dinner at the White House with Theodore Roosevelt. He'd even been to tea with Queen Victoria. I mean, he was very well-known. At that time, Rosenwald was a little less well-known, but he also was a prominent man. He was the president of Sears Roebuck, which was one of the very most successful commercial enterprises in the country. And in the years that followed that, he became highly regarded as a philanthropist of unusual vision and imagination. When Rosenwald died in 1932, the front page of the New York Times had a headline that said, "Rosenwald dead, nation mourns him." So that gives you an idea of how well known these guys were.
Right, yeah. Now, without jumping ahead a little bit, they, between the two of them, put together about 4,000 schools in the segregated South at that time.
5,000, actually.
5,000, okay.
It was a huge number, and I think, that, as you say, this is jumping ahead, but I think what made their collaboration so interesting was it was really a three-way collaboration because it was the two of them, but they chose to involve the communities. Mm-hmm. At this time in the South, we're talking about 1911 when they met, there were very many places where there just were no schools for black children. Most of the public school systems allocated their funds extremely unevenly between their white schools and their black schools. And many African Americans lived in very rural parts of the South, and they just had no schools. If they went to school at all, it was 4 months a year. It was classes held in a church or a rundown building of some kind, but there really was a tremendous lack of schools.
Well, and this all came from the decision in 1896, right? The Supreme Court decision, which segregated, which made separate but equal.
Versus Ferguson, said that segregation was legal on trains, but I think the lack of schools for blacks really predates that. One of the things that I was sort of shocked at my own ignorance when I started to do the research here was when I realized that under slavery, of course, education was actually illegal. It wasn't just that there weren't good schools. There were no schools. So you had a generation of, the parents had no education, and then emancipation comes, and they have absolutely no tradition of schools. It was the need was just extraordinary, and the thirst for education for their children. Most newly freed slaves viewed that as this was the thing that was going to make a difference in their children's lives. They were going to be able to be educated.
Yeah, that was going to be their ticket out. And I agree with you. Something that you'd mentioned in the book that I thought was interesting. Rosenwald was smart enough to, anytime he made a donation, you mentioned this several times in the book, to any kind of a cause, it was always, okay, I want the people involved to donate what I'm donating. So they become a stakeholder and they have an interest in this. So he didn't build any schools by himself. He made sure the community got involved and was kind of a matching funds kind of a deal.
Yes, very much so. And actually, when you look at the total amount, contributed to these schools over the lifetime of the project from 1912 to 1932, the amount dollar for dollar contributed by the African Americans who used the schools was actually greater than Rosenwald's financial contribution. I always find that sort of a stunning fact.
Wow. But it's the fact that he motivated them and he kind of, primed the pump a little bit by getting them involved and providing the seed money to get this thing going.
Absolutely. It was seed money. It was expertise because he and Booker T. Washington in particular, had connections with the state. The states had state agents for what they called them, state agents for Negro schools, who were generally white people, but they did have a venue for approaching the state and working on getting them to support the schools as well, because the really brilliant thing about the program was these were public schools.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was in some ways it was a four-way collaboration, because the communities contributed money and often contributed land, contributed work, but then it became a public school and it was maintained by the state.
Mm-hmm. Our guest by phone, Stephanie Deutsch, author of You Need a Schoolhouse, the story of Booker T. Washington and Julius Rosenwald and the schools of the segregated South. So these two guys were two totally different men, different backgrounds, but in some ways, were they so different? They seem to have a lot of the same drive and same passion for what they did.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that was actually one of the things that interested me and hooked me on the story. They were very different in terms of background, but they were quite similar. They were both very practical people, much more interested in what can I do to solve this problem than what can I study about this problem? How can I kind of philosophize about it? They were very practical. They liked to look for solutions to problems, and they liked to look for solutions to immediate problems. And one of the reasons that Rosenwald had been so successful at Sears was he was very practical. And at the time he came into the Sears leadership, one of the problems the company had was that they weren't very reliable. They would there was a story that was told that one of the clerks filling an order sent a blue suit when a black suit had been asked for, and Rosenwald said to him, well, why didn't you send him a watch? Sort of, if you're not going to send him what he wants, what's the point? And he was put a big emphasis on reliability. If Sears is going to make its reputation, it's because when people send away for things, they're going to get what they order. So it was very practical steps like that that had made him successful in business. And he took that same kind of attitude. Well, of course, Booker T. Washington was also very similar. He had been dealing with the practical problems of establishing a school in rural Alabama where there was just nothing. And he had literally built that school. The students who enrolled there built the buildings on the campus. They made the bricks. They built the building. It was a very practical approach to solving problems, and I think that was one of the things they had in common.
Stephanie, did that end up being a disadvantage, though, in a way, for Booker T. Washington? Because because he was so pragmatic and he looked at the practical way of getting along. He's gotten criticism, as of late, the last 50 years, for not really being a part of being aggressive enough in promoting the black causes. When he was in a position of authority.
That's for sure. His reputation has suffered terribly, and I think undeservedly. The time in which he was living was a time of absolutely virulent racism. It's a time when lynchings were sadly much more frequent than I thought when I started doing my research here. It's a time when there was a lot of hostility, and he felt that building up the strength of the African American community through education and through self-sufficiency was the most important way to advance their cause. He never gave up on the idea that eventually there would be equal opportunities and equal rights. I read a very touching letter that he wrote late in his life in an article. He said, just because the black man doesn't say something every time he's insulted and hurt doesn't mean he doesn't feel it. He was very aware of a lot of what was going on, but he felt that the contribution he could make was through education and through building up the communities, building up the pride and self-respect of having jobs and having professions and being an educated, capable community.
Yeah, and he did a great job of that. When we come back in a moment, there's a couple of stories you told in the book that I want to pick up on. We'll be back in a moment on Taking Care of Business on Kern Radio, News Talk 1180.